Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we've got another unscripted movie review. Haven't done one of these in a while for the new film directed by Stephen Williams, Chevalier. Before we go any further, I want to have a quick note here on biopics, specifically the historical biopic kind that are very much staged as a costume drama, a period piece. I have very mixed opinions on them as someone who does tend to like a lot of history, but when there is a singular focus on one particular character, I have mixed opinions on how often it tends to work. Because regular people don't fit into a traditional 3-act or 5-act structure, and more importantly, when you're taking that specific character, you have the desire to try to modernize elements of their performance to try to make a point that would feel relevant to a modern audience when in reality the larger socio-political climate around these characters, well, it sometimes just takes more time to fully flesh out and let it fully breathe. And sometimes there's a level of complexity that doesn't fit very well into a more structured traditional biopic narrative that has specific ups and downs. That's kind of one of the bits of frustration I have with Chevalier, which is based on an incredible true story of Joseph Bologne, aka the Chevalier, in pre-French Revolution France. The interesting thing about this character, played by Kelvin Harrison Jr., is that, again, the more you read about him and actually go back and do the historical research, the more you realize this guy is sort of too incredible. The sort of character that you could slot into that specific moment of history, and even despite all the right-wing fuckheads who would call this completely unrealistic, no, he actually was this incredible. He was this insanely talented, almost more so than what you see in this movie. We'll get into that. So, okay, what is his story? Well, he was the son of a white plantation owner and a black slave, and he got sent to France, specifically to one of the higher education schools, because his father recognized his talent and was told to be an extremely excellent Frenchman. Grow up and go several years later, he is something of a libertine on the streets of France. He's got his connections in the court, thanks to his insanely complex violin skills, his operatic composure, and his superb fencing, which I honestly wish we saw a little bit more of the latter throughout the course of the movie. We will get into that. So, overall, his character arc throughout the story here, not to spoil too much, is that he wants to become the director of the French opera, even as France is on the verge of falling into civil war with the French Revolution. This movie is trying to do a lot, and you can tell that there are limitations to what it can do, and I don't think that's all of the movie's fault. For one element, you are very much trying to translate a historical complexity that comes in pre-French Revolution France that, while you get broad strokes that are often painted surrounding the decadent aristocracy that was losing the consent of the masses and was very much on the cusp of falling to pieces, the French Revolution is kind of a lot more complicated if you look into the politics around Robespierre and the Reign of Terror and then what led into Napoleon. I get the idea of showing it all through Chevalier's character, Joseph Bologne, that you are able to get a certain focal point and play it more for a historical period piece about this one guy who is awesome. The interesting thing is that they probably could have made him more awesome than they do, especially play into what he was in the context of the French Revolution, but we'll get into that in a second. The one thing that you could also clearly tell is that the producers, as much as they want to center and focus his own arc, they also really want to play up the love story because, hey, Bridgerton has done exceedingly well, even if the second season's got mixed reviews. So why not play into that? Play into some of the pomp and classic romance of it all. And the great thing I can say is that Kelvin Harrison Jr. has phenomenal chemistry with Samara Weaving. It helps that the fact that the movie nails the setting and the score so effectively. The costumes are very well done. A lot of the direction, I think, takes a little bit too much of a liberal usage of montage to skip through so much of Chevalier's life, which you kind of have to do. We're coming up to the point where there's a real reason why they had to do it. But overall, it plays very effectively in centering them, centering the romance, making it feel lived in and believable, and also giving Joseph Bologne some real complexity, because Samara Weaving is playing someone who is not his wife. Then there's also the element of Marie Antoinette, who's played by Lucy Boynton. I actually think her chemistry with Kelvin Harrison Jr. is really, really solid. While I think the dialogue probably could have been punched up a little bit more to showcase some rapier wit from Kelvin Harrison Jr., I think he makes the best of a character that's really required to do quite a lot of heavy lifting. And while there are moments I feel it can feel a bit rushed, especially between the second and third act, again, we will get to this, I do think that he brings across a lot of that classic arrogance that comes with being a French libertine and who is exceedingly excellent in so many things in his life. I actually was really impressed with a lot of the character work that he was required to do, especially as his mother returns from the plantation having been freed, and she now enters into his life and brings a different sort of complexity to his story. So let's get to that main primary issue that comes with this movie. Despite how beautiful it is, despite how reasonably well written the dialogue is, despite how excellent the chemistry and the acting and the romance is showcased, the dramatic beats hit very effectively. I think Stephen Williams, despite not having a ton of film experience, he predominantly worked in TV. I think in terms of his direction, it's effective. This is also a movie that runs very briskly. It is a film that you can tell feels cut down. I think there is this assumption that a lot of historical biopics can feel very long and very ponderous, but I mean, that's kind of what you get in for. If you're going for a big, interesting historical biopic set across one of the most monumental events in human history, and I do consider what the French Revolution was in terms of geopolitics to be one of those events, it's kind of frustrating that they don't really embrace it. That to me says they may have wanted to, and there may have been budget cuts, there may have been elements where they were forced to work within a very narrow snapshot of telling Chevalier's story. Now, the interesting thing with that is I actually do think they hit a lot of the great thematic beats. Given that he is a man of such excellence and he has managed to find a lot of success within France to the point where he feels like he can bowl over any sort of expectation that is ultimately constrained by being a black man on the streets of Paris. And you can tell that there are some very distinct parallel themes across those who are trapped within systems that they would love to change, but may not have that level of power, at least not yet. Joseph Bologne being trapped by the racism of that era of France, although, again, kind of more complicated than it's shown in the film. Again, this is a film that probably needed another hour to fully flesh everything out. Samara Weaving's character really focusing on the emancipation of women, which again, the French Revolution kind of grasped at and then kind of pulled back. It was complicated. And then the element of where I actually think they did a slightly more interesting and nuanced portrayal of Marie Antoinette as the queen, who ultimately didn't have the sort of power to effect the change that she wanted, given that the monarchy was in a rather precarious situation pre-revolution. Now, the interesting thing that I like about those dynamics is that it shows that sort of systemic limitation, where ultimately when Chevalier is denied that opera house, that lead that he wants to take, the director of the opera, it actually shows the harsh limits that come to the systematized, individualized, black excellence story, where in reality it is systemic change that would be required, maintaining connection with your own culture. And I actually do really like they push in, drill into that theme. Then when they finally reach the apex of the film, where a specific concert does go off, and you feel like it's reaching a climax point where ultimately his arc has concluded, at least within the traditional structure, the film very sharply cuts off at that point, and I'm left feeling that as the couple of different text crawls come up to talk about what else happened in Joseph Bologne's life, I'm like, well, crap, I wanted to see all of that next. That's the frustrating thing. If you know the historical context of this time period, you can go and you can point to elements like, say, the French Revolution and Chevalier's role in it, how his role was impacted by the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, who actually banned a lot of his specific music and reinstated slavery. It's very interesting to highlight how those sort of roiling, monumentous systemic changes that he ultimately would succeed in finding would have different impacts upon one's life. There's a complexifying factor there. Again, similar to how that would impact monarchy or how that impacted the rights of women. Again, this is a film that feels like it was very cut down to try to get in as much of a completed thematic arc as they could while playing into the romance. It does run at a really brisk pace, and ultimately to the point where I think there was a lot that may have been cut on the floor just to get it in and get as much as they could out of it. And even then, it does feel like the marketing has kind of been short-circuited for this. Maybe it was the lukewarm reception at TIFF where they're putting it out now in April. And while I would appreciate a complexifier and an expansion, I kind of understand why the film was built the way it is, because they have to play to the classic pomp and romance. They're trying to get in some of the Bridgerton crowd. Outside of that, they might seriously struggle to get more of those complicated narratives that would probably be better served in like a 6-7 episode TV series. That being said, as much as I would appreciate a script that had a little bit more weight and complexity to it, I can't deny that Chevalier works for what it does. The score, especially if you like classical music, is phenomenal. Even if there are points where I personally would nitpick little bits and pieces of it, I do appreciate that a lot of Chevalier's symphonies are being rediscovered and the integration of them into this movie is good. I would appreciate a form of classical music that is not as whitewashed as it has historically been, really highlights the composers of color who worked throughout the course of the 1700s and 1800s and the Baroque and Romantic periods. And like, it's not just Chevalier. You can argue that Beethoven fits in this classification as well. One more point about classical composers. The fight between Chevalier and Mozart, it didn't technically happen like that, but it's one of those cases where you have to play for what an established audience would recognize in terms of that sort of competitive fervor. Part of that is because at one point Joseph Bologne and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart actually boarded together for how long and what that ultimately meant, but at the same time, again, it's one of those elements of complexity that I would have loved to see expanded, but you could tell this film was trying to hit its mark, actually try to get as much as it could within that 3-act structure, and really nail on those themes focusing on systemic racism and how the stories of Black excellence can actually be inspirational, but ultimately a deeper, both internal and then external changes would need to be driven to actually drive forth real tangible change. Now, granted, the next level of complexity is saying, okay, here's what that change entails. Here are the risks that come with it. But again, this is a movie that's trying to have as much breezy romance and not be a philosophical treatise as much as I might personally want it. But that's the complicating factor when you make a historical biopic around a man who is as incredible and as thematically resonant as Joseph Bologne was within a very complicated historical time period, and you're trying to also make it a pretty frothy and interesting romance along the way. Overall, I think the movie is good. I think it's actually very good. It's beautifully shot. It's very romantic. I think it's going to get the Bridgerton crowd if it was advertised properly to them. I don't think it's going to do tons of business, especially given what it's up against. And again, the advertising campaign has been nowhere near as good as it should be. I do think it's a little short on action, especially given what the historical context of who Joseph Bologne was. I feel like it kind of stops right before a fully fledged next act could have really taken this over the top, but it also gives me the impression that was not the primary focus and there were some constraints in terms of what they wanted to tell here. But overall, it was a very good movie. A little light on the script, but overall, I think there's going to be a lot of people who will be enraptured by the emotion of it, and I had a really good time. I don't give film ratings anymore, but if you want to check this out, you probably should. It's good stuff. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be extremely grateful. Again, I don't do that many film reviews, and the reason why is they don't get often put on my schedule. If you want to change that, link to my Patreon is right over there. Once again, don't have to. I understand times are tough out there for everyone, but the option is available. Until then, I'm Mark. You're watching Spectrum Pulse. I'll see you next time.